Amaka was a young girl who lived with her mother in a small house in the village. They were very poor, and their only source of income came from selling bananas. Every day after school, Amaka's mother would prepare bundles of bananas for her to sell along the busy streets in the evening. Amaka loved helping her mother. No matter how tired she was, she always carried her tray of bananas happily, calling out to passers-by and selling everything before returning home. She knew that selling the bananas was their only way of surviving, so she never complained. One day, Amaka returned from school as usual. Her mother welcomed her warmly and began to arrange the bananas on a tray. But that day, Amaka didn't feel like herself. She sat quietly, staring at the floor. "Mama, I don't feel like going out today," she said, her voice low. Her mother turned to her with concern. "What's wrong, my child? Are you sick?" Amaka shook her head slowly. "I'm not really sick, but I feel strange, like I shouldn't go out today." Her mother knelt beside her and gently held her shoulders. "Amaka, you are probably just tired from school. Don't worry. By the time you come back, I'll prepare your favorite meal." Hearing those words, Amaka smiled a little. Her mother always knew how to cheer her up. "All right, Mama," she said, standing up. Her mother arranged the bananas neatly on the tray and helped her balance it on her head. "Be careful, my daughter. Come back soon." Amaka nodded, her mood lifting as she walked out into the evening streets. But on that day, something tragic happened. As Amaka walked along the street selling her bananas, a man standing by the roadside called out to her. "Hey, little girl, I want to buy bananas," he said with a smile. Amaka stopped and balanced her tray carefully on her head. "How many do you want, sir?" she asked politely. The man looked around and then said, "Actually, my friends are in an uncompleted building just over there. We all want to buy bananas. In fact, we will buy all your bananas." At first, Amaka shook her head. "I can't follow you there. If you want to buy, you can buy here," she said firmly. The man chuckled. "Don't worry, my little sister. My friends are waiting inside. They will buy everything. You won't have to walk around anymore this evening." When Emeka heard that they wanted to buy all her bananas, she hesitated. The thought of going home early with all the bananas sold made her happy. She decided to follow the man to the uncompleted building. When they got there, the place was dark and quiet. Amaka looked around but didn't see anyone else. "Where are your friends?" she asked, her voice shaking a little. The man smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'll buy everything myself." He handed her the cash for all the bananas, and Amaka's face lit up with excitement. "Thank you, sir," she said, already thinking about how happy her mother would be. She placed the empty tray on her head and turned to leave. But as she walked out of the uncompleted building, she didn't notice that the man was following her. Suddenly, he grabbed her from behind. Amaka tried to scream, but before she could, he covered her face with a white handkerchief. The strange man buried Amaka alive in this shallow grave inside his uncompleted building, sealing her beneath layers of cement. He left the site that night, knowing he had committed an unspeakable act. But to him, it was all for a purpose. He was desperate to make money, and this ritual was supposed to give him exactly what he wanted. A month later, everything began to change for the man. Out of nowhere, he became incredibly wealthy. He bought expensive cars, wore luxurious clothes, and became the envy of everyone in the community. With his newfound wealth, he completed the building where Amaka was buried. What was once an abandoned structure now stood as a magnificent mansion, a grand, beautiful house that caught the eye of everyone who passed by. No one knew the secrets
buried beneath the house. They didn't know that a young girl, Amaka, lay beneath the polished floors of the mansion. The man moved into the house with his wife, and together they lived happily, enjoying their wealth and luxury. Meanwhile, Amaka's mother lived in sorrow. It had been over a month since her daughter disappeared, and not a day passed without her thinking about Amaka. She still hoped, deep down in her heart, that her daughter would come back one day. Every evening, she would sit by the door, staring at the path Amaka used to take when she went to sell bananas. She asked everyone she met if they had seen or heard anything about her daughter, but no one had answers. The silence was unbearable. So one day, after weeks of agony and sleepless nights, Amaka's mother made a drastic decision. Amaka lay unconscious in the dark, cold room of the uncompleted building. The man stood over her, silent and focused. With a shovel in his hands, he began digging a grave in the corner of the room. When the grave was deep enough, the man lifted Amaka's slim body and placed her inside. He covered her with the dirt slowly until she was completely buried alive. He mixed cement and poured it over the grave, sealing it as if nothing had ever happened. Back at home, it was already 7 p.m. and Amaka's mother was so worried. Each day Amaka goes to sell banana, she comes back at exactly 6 p.m. But tonight was different. She was nowhere to be found. Her mother paced back and forth, looking out the door, hoping to see her daughter walking down the path. She should be home by now, her mother murmured, her heart racing. Where could she be? By 8 p.m., the worry became unbearable. Amaka's mother decided to go out and search for her daughter. She walked through the village, calling out Amaka's name. Amaka, Amaka, where are you? She stopped people along the way, asking if they had seen her daughter. She was selling bananas, she told them, but no one had seen her. Hours passed, and by midnight, Amaka's mother was exhausted and heartbroken. She returned home with no sign of her daughter. Sitting on the floor, she burst into tears, crying bitterly. She told me she didn't want to go today. She said she wasn't feeling well, but I made her go. I convinced her. Amaka's mother couldn't bear the agony any longer. Her daughter had been missing for over a month, and every day felt like torture. With no answers and no hope, she decided to take a drastic step. Late one night, she tied a wrapper around her waist, picked up a lantern, and walked to the home of a native doctor. The village was quiet and dark, with only the sound of crickets filling the air. When she arrived, the native doctor welcomed her into his shrine. The room was dimly lit with candles, and the walls were lined with strange carvings and charms. Amaka's mother sat down, trembling, and poured out her heart. Please, I need to know what happened to my daughter, she begged, tears streaming down her face. The native doctor closed his eyes and began to chant. He threw some cowries on the floor and stared at them for a long time. Finally, he looked up at her with a grave expression. Your daughter is dead, he said. Amaka's mother gasped, shaking her head. No, no, that can't be true. She was used for a ritual, the native doctor continued. Her spirit is not at rest, but do not worry. Her spirit will seek revenge for what happened to her. Amaka's mother sat in shock, unable to speak. Her hands trembled as the weight of the words sank in. It's my fault, she whispered. She didn't want to go that day. I made her go. I killed my own daughter. She left the shrine in a daze, tears blinding her as she walked through the dark village streets. When she reached her small home, she collapsed on the floor and cried bitterly. The pain was unbearable. Her daughter was gone and she had no one left in the world. The guilt consumed her. She kept replaying the moments when Amaka told her she didn't want to sell bananas that day and how she had convinced her to go. If only I had listened, she sobbed. Unable to forgive herself, Amaka's mother made a terrible decision. Without thinking twice, she ended her own life, believing it was the only way to escape the unbearable pain and guilt. Amaka, the banana girl who was buried alive in the strange man's house, was not at rest. Her spirit was filled with bitterness, especially after her mother had taken her own life in grief and guilt. She rose as a restless ghost, determined to avenge what had been done to her. The strange man, now living in his grand mansion with his pregnant wife, began to experience strange occurrences in the house. It started small, but quickly became terrifying. At first, his wife noticed unusual things whenever her husband was out. She would cook, only to find the pot empty the next moment, even though she hadn't eaten yet. She thought it was her husband sneaking food, but he denied it. Sometimes she would leave something in one spot, only to find it in another place moments later. After a while, she gave birth. The day she brought the baby home, everything seemed fine. But the very next morning, the baby was found dead. The wife was devastated and terrified. The man's troubles were far from over. Amaka's ghost started appearing to him. Each time, she carried a tray of bananas on her head, just as she had when she was alive, and shouted, "Confess, confess." Her ghostly figure haunted him relentlessly. But instead of confessing, the man grew angrier and more determined to silence her spirit. Performed rituals and incantations at the exact spot in the house where he had buried Amaka alive. But instead of silencing her spirit, Amaka's ghost became even stronger. She began to disturb the house even more. Objects moved on their own. Strange sounds echoed through the mansion, and the atmosphere grew darker and heavier by the day. The man's wife couldn't take it anymore. She decided to leave the house and run far away. But as she was descending the staircase with her bags, she slipped, fell, and died instantly. Amaka's ghost appeared immediately, laughing airily and shouting, "Nobody leaves this house alive." When the strange man returned home, he found his wife lying lifeless at the bottom of the staircase. Overcome with grief, he cried bitterly, but as he mourned, Amaka's ghost appeared once more, carrying her tray of banana and chanting, "Confess, confess." The man was terrified, but his stubbornness and pride wouldn't allow him to confess. The situation worsened. Anyone who visited the man's house never left alive. Neighbors whispered about the cursed mansion, warning each other to stay away. Desperate to escape, the man decided to leave the country. He obtained a visa, packed his belongings, and prepared to flee. But as he was about to leave the house with his bags, something snapped in him. He started behaving erratically and ran into the streets, shouting, "I buried the banana girl alive in my house. Confess, confess." The man had gone mad. He wandered the streets, haunted by Amaka's ghost and tormented by his guilt. To this day, Amaka's spirit still roams the mansion, carrying her tray of bananas and shouting, "Confess, confess." Anyone who dares to enter the house never comes out alive. The mansion stands as a grim reminder of the terrible injustice done to the banana girl.